So good afternoon, everyone. And it is our pleasure to be here. I'm Chris Ruggeri. I lead the sustainability, climate and equity practice for Deloitte for our risk and financial advisory business. I'm joined here by two of my colleagues on the far right, or my far right, your left. My good colleague, Dan Kinsella, who leads our third-party risk and extended enterprise supply chain business. He is, all full disclosure, he is South Dakota's favorite son, and he cuts an awfully mean corn maze. To my immediate right is Naba Sengupta. Naba is also in our supply chain area of practice, and we're hoping to engage you in a dialogue or in a conversation today to really get you thinking about connectivity. So just to get us kicked off, before we start, I just wanted to give a shout out to the folks at Junk Couture. I don't know if any of you have seen them wandering around the Javits Center, but Junk Couture has done amazing things, and at Deloitte we are very proud to partner with them. They literally take junk and turn it into some other people's junk and waste and turn it into elegant fashion solutions. It's a shame it's not Fashion Week because they would clearly be featured on the runway. So if you see Junk Couture around, please say hello to them. They also are a good reminder to all of us that we all play a really important role in sustainability. It's not one person's challenge, it's not one company's challenge, it's not one country's challenge. It's all of us. And all of us can make a difference, and I think our partners at Junk Couture have demonstrated that one piece of trash at a time. Now, to get us started, I'm gonna ask all of you to indulge me. I'm gonna ask you to use your imagination. And what I want to do is I want you to, in your mind's eye, to create a picture. And let me give you some information to shape that picture. So imagine it's 2050. So about one and a half generations from now. You wake up, you're in an air-conditioned room. It's April. It's 105 degrees outside. It's hot. Your windows are closed, the air outside is stale. You roll out of bed, you find your way to your kitchen. You grope around in the cabinets for coffee and for breakfast, only to find that you don't have any coffee because it's become scarce. And in fact, if you can find it, it's terribly expensive. Your options for breakfast are somewhat limited. You take a very short shower because water scarcity, because of increased prevalence of drought, water scarcity is increased. And so short shower, you get onto your commute to work on congested roads, sitting in traffic. Sounds pretty miserable. By the time you get to the office, you find you're with your colleagues who are not looking terribly happy. They also have had a similar experience. The lights in your office are flickering a little bit because energy reliability has diminished. At the end of the day, you repeat that same sequence home. By the time you get home, it's too hot to enjoy time outside. You go back to sleep, and you rinse and repeat the next day. How does that sound to all of you? Does it sound good? No, it sounds pretty terrible. Would anyone be willing to sign up for that? I hope not, because if you are, you're in the wrong place. So let me now create a different vision. So we're going to move beyond this hot. This feeling of heat, sweltering, scarce resources, limited availability. And I want to paint a picture now of something different. So again, in your mind's eye, I'd like you to just sort of, again, indulge me and imagine what the future could look like. So again, it's 2050. You awaken to a new day. You're excited about it, about the opportunities the day will bring. You're snuggled under your covers. The windows are open. Fresh air is pouring in because there's still a little chill in the air. It's April. You leap out of bed. You skip into your kitchen to find to have breakfast. There's an abundance of coffee and nutritious, well-balanced food for you to eat. You recognize that perhaps some of that food was, in fact, benefited from the care you've taken in composting, in taking materials that can then be used to amend the soil, increase crop yields, and improve the availability of food for all of us. And in fact, I'm hoping that my friend Dan will contribute some of his clothing to that compost heap, because Dan's fashion sense, is unique.
Fashion Week, right?
It is Fashion Week, or it's coming up. But then you then decide it's time to take a shower, and using highly efficient plumbing fixtures, shower heads, you then get dressed, off to the autonomous hydrogen-powered tram that takes you to work. You meet your colleagues at your co-worker spaces. You have abundant energy supplied by clean, renewable power sources. You have a productive day at work. At the end of the day, you get back on the tram, and you head home through green corridors. Perhaps you enjoy some time with friends or family on your green roof. You end your day with a nutritious, well-balanced meal. And the next day, and thinking about how excited you are about the day to come tomorrow. So these are two very different scenarios. And my belief is that, and based on what I've heard at this conference today, and just this week in New York, which is quite magical, is the power of ideas, the power of people coming together to solve complex challenges. So think about the difference between the two scenarios I just painted for you. The first one is really defined by continued conspicuous consumption of increasingly scarce resources, environmental degradation, all the things that the way we've lived, frankly, for the last 100 and, well, at least 50 years. The second scenario I painted for you, which is much more, hopefully you find much more intriguing and attractive, is based on us coming together and creating a connected, circular economy, sustainable economy. So what I want to challenge you to do is, as we go through our discussion this afternoon, is I want you to think connected. I want you to think about some of the things that you individually can do, your companies can do, if you are involved in or an official in government, the role government has to play in solving these very complex challenges that we all face. And I'm very intrigued by what I've heard today in terms of everything from carbon capture, the waste renewal, circularity, sustainability at its core. So with that, what I'd like to do, Dan, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. And I'd like to really, there's a lot happening. There's a lot going on here. Tell us what your thoughts are and some of the ideas we have to better connect these ecosystems.
Absolutely. And that's a dangerous option you gave me.
I should have warned the audience.
So this is my forest hat. I just spent a lot of time in the forests of Alaska this summer. And I want to paint a picture for you of some time I spent in a forest in Yellowstone and talking with the park rangers in a concept they call cascading troposphere. And one of the challenges they were trying to figure out was They knew that there were questions around how the wolves impacted the ecosystem and how the different animals that tourists came to see and that the ecosystem supported were interconnected, but they were really struggling to figure out what was going on with the moose who have suddenly disappeared from the Yellowstone ecosystem. And after years of study, one of the things that they figured out was it's these interconnected ecosystems that absolutely are at play together. And so what happened, which was incredibly intriguing to me, and it still is interesting to me, and I study these kinds of systems both in our natural world as well as our business world. And when we talk about supply chain, these concepts apply to both. In this instance, what had happened was that because of a lack of predators in the environment, and that we were, as humans, feeding the bears, and we also had a lack of wolves in the lower 48 states, that what happened was there were 5 times the number of elk than probably should have been in the area. And for those of us that didn't know it, and I didn't know it at the time, elk eat everything. They eat everything that they can touch, including trees and everything off the trees. They're like lawnmowers. And so what had happened in their environment was the overabundance of elk ate everything. And guess what the beavers like? Beavers like little trees. And guess where there were little trees? There were none. So all the beaver left. And what happened was once they got that balance back in place, right, and the beavers could find sticks, and once the beavers find sticks, they create beaver dams, and then beaver dams create marshlands, and the marshlands attract the moose, right? So when you think of these kind of interconnected water cycles, animal cycles, plant cycles, right, think of the supply chain. And you wonder of the supply chain challenges that we've had in recent months and years, and you think of some of the interconnectedness, but now think of it in the future. We've historically had very linear supply chains. And think of the concept of extraction, processing, use, and waste. Extraction, processing, use, waste. And everything kind of followed that cycle, generally speaking, in our consumer-based world. And compare that to that cycle that I just described in nature. And the reality is that we have to start to think very differently in a more circular type approach, more natural type approach, in order for us to have a true environment that connects opportunity to where we need to get to your future, Chris. So when I think about where we're headed next in this concept of interconnectivity, it makes me think of one of my other favorite characters, which Chris is like cringing here. And I won't, but think of the spider web, Spider-Man, right? In the area of connectivity. We are all interconnected in this web together. And as the web goes, effectively we'll all go. And if we don't have an effective web, we're not going to have this effective future like you want. So that interconnection is absolutely key. Now, we're going to focus on just 4 main topics here because our time is short with you. But we'd like to continue the dialogue, and certainly the dialogue contains more than this, these 4 areas. But we're going to talk about the interconnectedness of mobility, food, power, and people. Mobility, food, power, and people. So Chris, all topics near and dear to my heart, given that I'm from the breadbasket of America.
Yes, you are.
Right, I have some perspective on needing to travel to get out of the breadbasket. Food that we create, and right?
You are on a roll, so why don't you take us into mobility?
Okay, so mobility is this concept that we all know. And I'm putting on my Africa hat. This was a hat that is from Africa, and my family and I were mobile and had the opportunity to purchase this hat from locally made products and services from folks in Africa. And when we think about the fact, and we all know this in some fashion, but basically, when we think about vehicles and transportation, and all of us took probably some form of transportation, maybe a few of you walked, but most of us probably didn't. When we think about that, about 1/4 of the world's carbon dioxide emissions come from mobility, right? Now, one of the things that you may not know when you think about automobiles and other forms of transportation, about 12% of the world's steel is used for automobiles, and 27% of the world's aluminum. And yeah, we recycle. We recycle certain pieces of automobiles, And there's some positive zero-emission vehicles, right? But when we think of zero-emission vehicles, are they truly achieving what we hope to achieve? Is it truly circular in commitment? Now, I would tell you, my wife would hope that we would have a truly circular economy and that some of the old vehicles, because I have this passion, like let's keep it, if it works, why would we not keep it going? So I've got a 1953 tractor, I've got a 1971 truck, and these are things that I've continued to use recycled parts. I have a geothermal system. I take this stuff to heart. I try to live what I preach. But at the same time, when we think of these zero-emission vehicles that we have now, which are great, but we're using probably high-emission energy, right? With effectively, and we'll talk about power here in a minute, but we're using high-emission energy to actually create that opportunity to use that electric vehicle. We have this circular economy, but it really doesn't connect to the dispositioning of the entire car. So a definition in this case of circular would be that the vehicle and all of the transportation, so back to kind of the extraction, the production, the use, and the waste, that would all be net zero. Not just when I'm actually using the vehicle, but that entire circular life cycle. Now, that's going to create a need for circularity through electricity generation, production of the vehicles, the chemicals industry, biofuels, the supply chains, city designs, right? That's particularly complicated. When you look at the United Nations, which obviously they're meeting here today, and the Sustainable Development Goals, mobility is kind of woven into multiple of them, but it's very critical, right? So Chris, this is just a little glimpse of that concept of mobility, again, which we're all connected to, and kind of thinking broader to start to achieve that beautiful vision that you allayed us earlier.
It is a beautiful vision, and one of the components of that beautiful vision is healthy, abundant food. And President Biden said it this morning in his remarks at the United Nations, there are almost 200 million people around the world that are in a very desperate need for food and are desperately food insecure. So Naba, I'd like to bring you into the conversation because one of the key considerations here in sustainability is we need to make sure that we address food scarcity, food equity, and a lot of that has to do with the supply chain. So what do you think?
Sure, so I love talking about food. It's not just because I'm a foodie, but some of my earliest memories when I was growing up was visiting a farm, seeing the cattle grazing, planting a seed, watching it grow, the bearing of the fruits, the flowers, the entire life cycle and the ecosystem growing out of it. That really brings back such fond memories to me that I always think about food in that connected cycle. But when we think about the food system right now, there is a lot which is missing. The circular concepts that Dan was talking about, it's not completely bringing to bear the food ecosystem. Some case in point, some of the recent studies indicate that over 1/3 of the food that is being produced never comes to the consumer because it's wasted or it's spoiled or it's disposed of because it's not pretty looking. That's a telling statistic. And if you combine that with world hunger and the growth of our populations, that's just, the formula doesn't add up. Another telling stat, depending on how you define the food ecosystem, between 4.4 gigatons to 9 gigatons of CO2 equivalent is connected to the food ecosystem. So when you think about that, then those are big challenges that we are trying to solve for. And it always comes back down to the circular concepts. So when we are talking about the food ecosystem and circular concepts, we're really talking about how do we go from this multiple areas where there are inefficiencies, for example, deforestation due to land usage, the destruction of the topsoil because the carbon preservation is not taken into account, the entire concept of processing, manufacturing in remote parts, and then handing it back to you for consumption. Inside joke in the food industry is that a sandwich that you'll be holding in your hand is probably traveled the world 3 times. between the time when it got produced and manufactured, processed, packaged, and then handed back to you. That is a telling statistic. And even if we take that as an anecdote, there is so much that we can do around it. When we connected back the connection, we need to think about the holistic cycle. So it's not only about concepts like regenerative agriculture, it's not only about water preservation and conservation, it's also about thinking about the entire nutrition cycle. So how can we use circularity in the food concept? I would say that the first step is making sure that at each stage you're preserving and nurturing the resources that you're utilizing for growing food. The second aspect is throughout the manufacture cycle, how can we make sure that the quality and the nutritional component of food is at the most elevated level so that you're not destroying nutrition at that stage? And then how can you weed out the waste cycles that are coming up as well? So spoilage through transportation, effective ways by which you are preserving and you're storing and packaging and handing it over to the consumer. So that's really where the food ecosystem is, and it gets so much connection with the social element of equitable distribution of resources, making sure that the growers are paid in an equitable manner and empowered with data as well, so that they can take the right call based on the cycle of climate as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a great segue, Naba, into as we're challenging our audience to think connected. We can't think connected without talking about energy. So Dan, how does energy dovetail into this whole notion of interconnectedness?
Energy is near and dear to my heart. Yes, and to on a serious note, if you could take me seriously, to Naba's point on 200 million people, and Chris are struggling to have food today. That's deplorable for all of us, really. I mean, there's just with drones, with the world we live in, like really we're letting that happen. We have to solve these kinds of real issues. These aren't theories. These are real people that are struggling for food. And when we think about the interconnectedness and the opportunity and how power fits into that, listen, 19 years ago at Deloitte, I put a conference call back then. Of course, we didn't have any video, and it was a 1-800 number. You might remember those things for those of you that have my hair and or age. And it was Alternative Energy Group. And we started, coalescing around this, and we now have a functioning renewable energy group. And Marlene Matika was on the first call, and she leads that group now with us. And it really is pretty darn exciting. But it's been a roller coaster. To suggest that it's been kind of this, onward and upward all the time. It's been up and down and around. And when we think about energy, we really have to be better. 60% of our energy is still from fossil fuels. And I understand there's a lot there, and that's not going to happen overnight, but we have to just understand that and realize that also with the manufacture of wind and those wind turbines, right, they come from somewhere and they get shipped, and I'm sure many of you have been on the roads when they're long and difficult, and some of them are shipping a third of the way across the country, right? How can we do that better? Think about the batteries and solar. Mm-hmm. Batteries also within cars, right, and some of the waste and things around there. So again, back to that notion of circularity, that concept has to be applied to, and again, I know people are working on this, but it has to be applied to power. One of the key tantamount points, I think, with all of this, and when we think about those who aren't getting enough food, when we think about power, we have to just change this mindset as an individual and as a world, that this is about we, not me. It's about we, not me, mm-hmm. right? And be thinking when we're having these discussions to connect and, how can we be better? How can we do this? How can we feed these people? And we can do this together, but we have to work together. Mm-hmm. I can't do it, you can't do it, but together it's a pretty powerful opportunity. So we have to think in power about these full life cycles. And also if it's good to grow your lettuce closer to home, shouldn't we produce our power closer to home? And how can we take some of the burden on the transformation and dispositioning of power, which I've actually been a part of now for 22, 23 years of how all that happens. Very complicated, I get it, but this is starting to happen. It's pretty darn exciting. But this circularity of how power connects to everything is something that you have to think about virtually every time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Dan, I want to follow up a little bit on, because you touched on this. I mean, we're talking about systems and circularity and supply chains, and sometimes it almost becomes dehumanizing. What I'd like to do is just bring us back to the human element of this. And Naba, what do you think? Tell us, how do we make sure that we don't lose that?
I think that's a great point, because when we use the word system, like for example, the UN General Assembly is talking about interlocking systems as one of the core message as a part of the General Assembly. When we think of systems, we think of interlocking, we don't really think about people. But this is about us. It's about all of us, the human race, the living beings, the plant life, animal life, microbiomes, all of us living on one planet, and we have to think holistically. So when we talk about the interconnection, it's really about, it can really come to fruition through all of us, whether it's about societal structures or cultural forces or even value systems. It's really incorporating the aspects of circularity into that, so that when we are waking up in the morning in the happy future that you painted for us.
That's the future I'm waking up in. I don't know about you guys. But.
And I hope I will be waking up as well, and all of us. So we have to change our mindset, that how do we positively influence the future so that we are a part of the solution. And that's why we didn't want this to be a conversation where we are talking down, because we are all a part of the problem and the solution. Mm-hmm. And that's where the interconnectivity comes up. When we connect it with other systems or other structures from a societal standpoint, it's also about the equitable distribution of resources. How do we make sure that grid infrastructure, smart cities, even public infrastructure like the high-speed rails working on green hydrogen, how do we make sure that that's accessible to the right communities? When we are growing and expanding our communities as well, each of the indigenous voices have a role to play on it. So that's where the connection really becomes human, because that's the glue in all of this really is the humans who are living, breathing, nurturing, and protecting the planet, and also looking at and envisioning a broad future for us.
Yeah, Naba, I want to take us to, because we've talked about very complex systems unto themselves, and obviously coming together as a system are even more complex. So what are some of your thoughts on how do we convert some of the knowledge we have today, and you are essentially a data scientist at heart. How do we convert some of that to action?
Yeah, so I would say that there is a lot that we are doing right now, which are working in their own silos, but we hear about it all the time. So take, for example, the use of artificial intelligence. Now, we use AI in so many different ways by which all of us are benefited. A common example of that is using that for developing smart infrastructure. One of my friends, my dear friends, he's a construction engineer, and he moved on the path of utilizing data for designing cities for the future. So that's an application that's happening right now. Blockchain. When we think of blockchain, then we think of Bitcoin, most of the cases, but then blockchain is the foundation of supply chains. It's also the foundation of a lot of the work that organizations are doing for weeding out forced labor, weeding out, indenture or modern slavery. When we talk of additive manufacturing, we hear about that in its own silo as if it's a science experiment, but it's being used right now for developing low-cost housing, for transforming the way we are using cement, the way we're using steel in production of a lot of the manufacturing equipment as well as housing. Internet of Things is another buzzword. We are using that in the grid infrastructure right now, as well as in the distribution apparatus, to really be able to identify where we can cut down on consumption and how can we allocate resources effectively so that the greener electricity can be used and the ones tied to fossil fuels can be underemphasized in low power times. So I think there's a lot that's happening from a tech standpoint. There's also a lot which is happening from a low tech standpoint. So take for example the innovation that we are doing around just the animal feed. Animal feed, if you think about it, you just feel that, okay, those are animal pellets. Those are just like feed pellets that are going to animals and that's a part of the cattle production. But the modern animal feed can actually cut down on the methane production from livestock by over 50%. And some of those are going to the 70% range. Just think of that. It's a small pellet and it's transforming the entire carbon economy. So I think, the emphasis that we want to make is that the future that we are envisioning, we really need to push harder towards that. And when we say push harder, it's about pushing the boundaries. So when we think of these systems, we still think of them as in their own silos. Then we start emerging from that and we see that they're connected. Now we need to break those barriers. If there's an innovation that's happening in one place, how can we deploy it in a different place so that the society, the societal structures are benefited from that? And I think it's when we were talking about this as well and some of the messages that we want to share with everyone over here, first of all, it's kudos to all of you that you've turned up in this lovely Javits Center, which is embodying so much of the future that we want to envision and the sustainable practices that we want to take. We want everyone to think about this not as carbon targets, not as certifications, not as a 2050 climate pledge. It's really about what kind of a planet do we want to live in and how do we make sure that we link hands together versus have a kind of a obstructionist view that no, this is my parcel of land and this is what I'm going to do and I don't care about the externalities. So it's really about expanding our horizon and that's what we want to emphasize to everyone over here and hopefully to a broader audience as well.
So Dan, you must have an opinion on this.
Oh yeah, I do. And being last name Kinsella, if you build it, they will come. This is my harvest hat. And now that we're in fall, it technically is harvest season. The harvest moon will be coming here in a couple weeks. Listen, if Iowa can go from having zero renewable energy really about 8 years ago to now, a lot of wind energy and number 2 in the country as far as wind energy production, listen, we can all do it. Right? And I think that's just one example of change. And when you think about what are we doing and how are we doing it, we are working at Deloitte with trying to have organizations create sustainable aviation fuel. That's important to us. We get it. We travel to serve our clients, and that's important for us to figure out how we can improve there. We also have an initiative of 100 million farmers in creating sustainable farming practices. I do live on an acreage. I've got a garden, I've got an orchard, I've got chickens, and listen, it's hard work, but I also have the place that I can do it. You can't currently do it in as many places until you create mechanisms like you have here, right? This creates an opportunity not just for food production, but also to create food in places that couldn't be created. We talked about growing the lettuce closer to home. Right? Those kinds of cycles and those initiatives we're supporting. And by the way, it's not just seeds and soil. You have to have financial perspective. You got to have supply chains connected to it. You've got to have data and technology, business strategy built in, right? So these considerations and connections really are important. We're also connected, as you might imagine, to the SEC, the various task force for climate disclosure, nature-related financial disclosure, so on and so forth. But another key tenet that you need to understand, I mentioned to you that linear supply chain before, and this is very near and dear to my heart. Listen, waste has to be an input. Waste has to be an input every time. And when you're going through this cycle of strategy, circularity, just like as you might hear, information security has to be built into every technology you have now. Circularity needs to be brought into the production of everything for every organization, every business. And that notion of zero every time, we just have to start to build it in. And that has to be a core tenet, right? So we're starting to build those into our practices at Deloitte when we think about the different businesses we're in, the ventures we have, the relationships we have, so on and so forth. One example is that a Smart Factory, which is in Wichita. It's a collaboration, and we are experimenting right there, right now, with waste as input, different kinds of printing and using digital means, digital twins, all kinds of stuff, and trying to put this concept into reality. So Chris, I know with all these considerations and with everybody around this nest, the best is yet to come. I'm sure of it.
Yeah, and I want to conclude our discussion where we started, which is challenging each of us to think connected, to act in a connected fashion. None of these solutions are the sole responsibility of anyone, nor does any one individual or company have the resources or capabilities to solve some of the complex challenges we're facing. So we can change the world, and at Deloitte, we are going to change the world. We're doing it one day at a time, one person at a time, one client at a time. So I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I enjoyed the conversation. I know my colleagues well, but I always learn something when I have the opportunity to engage with them. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you around the Javits Center over the course of the next day or so. Thanks very much.